What's up, guys? My name is Tim Kelly. I've been a strength and conditioning coach since 2017. I've worked at a place called Virginia High Performance for many of those years, and then after having my children, which one of them you see on this presentation right here, I got into my own business, the Athletes Online Strength and Conditioning, and I took all my years as a athlete as well as a coach and just put together a little presentation on my thoughts on the long-term athletic development. And the reason I say it's a building an 8-year plan because most people get somewhat serious about strength training and just training in general for sports at the highest level that we all aspire to, which is professionally or even collegiately. That gets started usually at middle school all the way through their high school years. So you have about an 8-year window in which to kind of chase these things if your child seems like a candidate for higher level sports, and that is either child driven or parent driven. I'm not here to get into a debate about that, but these are just some of the variables and some of the principles I've used along the way to help many parents navigate the long-term athletic development process. So what is long-term athletic development? Let's start with some of the myths. Growing up, we used to hear resistance training stunts growth and to not lift too much weights because you'll get too bulky, especially, I played college baseball, so that was a kind of a common stigma because baseball players need mobility, and, there was this kind of just lack of knowledge or ignorance around, what all goes into sports performance training, at least for my era coming up, and it got, grossly changed by things like Eric Cressy and Driveline and all of the many other people that have come after that with the kind of leading sports performance issues in the baseball world, and that is kind of my perspective on hearing that myth. The other one we hear a lot in the private sector is in-season versus off-season training. It's very cyclical in the private sector. These travel ball teams have large amounts of investments from parents, and they want to play as many games as possible, get their kids seen when they're at that showcase level as often as possible, and it's its own world, to say the least. And so a lot of parents come in, for off-season training, but when in-season is upon us, they kind of dwindle off, and that's not every kid, obviously, but it's kind of a myth that people hear from, kind of seeing pros train, their off-season training versus their in-season training, even though most pros, especially nowadays, basically follow a year-round program, and that's just kind of a common myth that we see a lot in the private sector. Sport-specific training as well. Again, just using the lens of baseball that I play, but any sport for that matter, golf, tennis, football, whatever, thinking that you need to bring some aspect of skill into the performance training environment, which is really weights, sleds, dumbbells, kettlebells, bands, all these things. Attaching your bat to a band and swinging is not going to make you hit the ball any harder. There's skill training, and there is strength training, basically, for the lack of a better term. So, to kind of flip those myths into facts, I would say resistance training improves motor skill. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but basically the bigger that you can make your muscles, the stronger you can make those bigger muscles, and the faster you can make those bigger, stronger muscles move, the better your motor skill will be for sports. That's why when, again, using baseball as an example, you see an 8-year-old hitting the bottom of a tee, they don't need hitting lessons. They just need to get a little stronger and do a lot of other things other than doing hitting lessons. Year-round sports requires year-round physical training. I would agree with that because physical training is just a life skill, as we're learning more and more by the day in the modern environment. And then the last one, improved musculoskeletal and nervous system adaptations transfer to sports skill. So for lack of a better term, if you get really strong and really explosive and you dedicate all of your mental energy for an hour into that pursuit with many modalities that people have already used, whether that's powerlifting, Olympic lifting, some of this landmine training you see nowadays, as long as you're moving heavyweight fast in the right volume and the right frequency, that will transfer to however often you're practicing your sports skill, and you will see improvements in that kind of physical capacity as far as it's measured in sports. And so one of the things that I try to get across to people is the art of mastery. And so whether that is the mastery of your sport, which again, very skill based, repetition, frequency, specificity, kind of whole part as far as practicing a portion of the skill and then integrating it into a practice or game and then reanalyzing whatever hole you have on a certain skill set and coming back to that. The same is true for the performance world. And so I kind of wanted to paint a picture to the type of client that I would see over the last 10 years or so. And this book is just something that I think everybody should read as far as just self-development and looking at just all of the variables in life for the success that you're looking for. These will give you a little bit of a guidebook on how to achieve that. But the keys to mastery are instruction, practice, surrender, intentionality, and the edge are kind of the keys that he talks about in this book. And we can see the similarities in sports skill and performance, right? There's coaches instructing something. There's the client who is practicing that skill. There is the surrender or the ego and the trust between the coach and the player and being able to chase this kind of goal together. And then there's the intentionality. The kids that I've worked with that have gone far, they have had it in their heart that they want to play at the college level or the pro level or whatever they've set their mind to. There's a reciprocal amount of effort that they had to create the intention for to achieve the things that they're looking for, right? And so that's the edge that this guy talks about in this book, The Mastery. And then he talks really the more important part than the keys to mastery is the enemies of mastery. So I call these the dabbler, the hacker, and the obsessive is kind of the layman's terms for what he talks about in the book. And those three figures I have illustrated in this kind of metaphorical journey that all athletes are on. So a simulacrum is like a small scale version of the bigger picture thing that we're talking about. And so I made this little kind of diagram as far as using that book and using it as an analogy for the sports performance world or just the sports world itself, acquiring a skill. So when you start off, you are this like innocent little voyager coming across the sea to a new land. Let's just use baseball as an example. You get exposed to t-ball or maybe you don't even start till you're in middle school, go out for your middle school team. Some people wait even longer and go out for their high school team. You just don't know what you don't know. You're innocent and there's nothing wrong with that. There's this whole world out there of mastery for even just the sport of baseball, let alone all the other sports. And so the dabbler is where that first kind of enemy of mastery comes in, and that's someone who just kind of plays for recreation, for fun, and maybe they say they want to play in college or pro, and they've been playing since they were 8 all the way to 16 years old now. But if they haven't really applied themselves deeper into something like weight training, speed training, going out and doing reps on their own, either with a coach or by themselves, for pitching and hitting and fielding and the millions of reps it takes to reach mastery, that is where many people fall short of their goals. Is they're basically just dabbling, even though they may think they are a very invested player in their own development process. So that's basically distractions get a lot of people, whether especially in high school it's friends or girls or other sports sometimes or video games. If you feel a call into a certain sport, you have to accept that challenge. And our job as coaches is to illustrate that point very clearly with each interaction that we have with them and to hold them accountable. This is where I would say, especially in the weight room, is the beginner. So when that freshman steps into the weight room and he's very skinny and very scared of the seniors, it's our job as coaches to help them understand this is just the beginning of their journey, and where they are right now is not where they can get to, but they have to be willing to put in the work. And I think most of us coaches realize that, but it's much more difficult to get across to all the people that we work with. From there, they go from the beginner to an intermediate, and that's where there's this kind of fallacy as people get a little bit more time and experience. Again, using the kind of baseball world, maybe they've been playing for 5, 6, 8 years. They're pretty good. They were on a regional travel ball team. They're one of the starters on their high school team, maybe fairly early as a freshman or sophomore, and they're kind of starting to run out of time for that window of getting drafted if that's their goal, or to get even to just a D3 college for those that don't quite have as much genetic potential. And they see all this stuff on the internet, and they see well-intentioned sports performance coaches like you and I, and they think if they can just do the one exercise or the one thing, they can hack their way into this dream of theirs, which is, being the next Mike Trout or Jackson Holiday or whatever. And so that is kind of, having the humility to understand where they are at truly and have a good support system around them, whether it's parents or coaches or even teammates, that can be like, yeah, you're pretty good for where you're at regionally, but this is what's happening nationally or even internationally. So kind of, that recognition and status climbing thing that we see with in the baseball world, it's perfect game. For football, it's max preps or whatever it may have you. These 4-star, 5-star recruits, ranking systems. Our jobs as performance coaches is to keep the kids humble, and we do that with both education but also intensification of certain exercises. And it's our job to kind of be cordial and friendly with them when they're beginners on that kind of grassy knoll and beach. But as things start to get harder and these kind of rolling hills of the intermediate playing field, and to avoid them kind of being the hacker where they're doing these kind of off gimmicky exercises, we kind of have to steer them past what I call the shadowlands of mediocrity. So that's the kids that fall into that kind of hacky, they're repeating things they see on the internet without a lot of guidance. They were well intentioned, but they can very quickly do very little to kind of get themselves into that advanced field unless they have good guidance to help them avoid pitfalls. Because to be honest, their time, though it seems like a lot in an 8-year span, is actually very short because it's slipping away. Time is the only non-renewable resource, and it seems like you have a lot of it when you're younger, but it is quickly dwindling away. And it's our job to help them get the biggest return on their investment by avoiding gimmicky exercises and wasted reps and all the things that come with that fallacy of being the hacker. And as they start to reach the end of that 8-year journey, and it's time, for them to get one step closer to the peak of their mountain, their dream, whether it be college baseball or college football or whatever sport it is, or even pro, if that's their aspiration, there's one more kind of enemy that we have to help them avoid, which is the obsessive one, right? And so I've seen this even in myself when I was growing up playing sports and getting into the weight room and all that stuff. While the weight room is an excellent tool to help you kind of navigate these craggy peaks of performance, because it is not sunshine and rainbows like it is in the beginner and intermediate field. There's a lot of ups, there's a lot of downs, there's a lot of dangerous things that come with playing high-level sports like injuries. It's very easy to obsess over, well, if I can just do 5 more pounds or I can do one more day of workout. We'll see this on the opposite end of kids who push it a little too hard and they don't actually know how to recover. They don't know how to properly balance out kind of that intrinsic drive with a balanced approach and kind of cognitive, emotional, behavioral tools that are necessary to succeed at the high level, because there is more and more pressure as they go down this journey. And so kind of the end goal of this is the coaches are Sherpas. Our job is to help them navigate these pitfalls, and also expedite the information or learning process that comes with understanding force velocity curves and kind of the intricacies of biomechanics and different techniques and different things like that. And so that way they're not having to spend years and years and years acquiring these things. They can hopefully what took maybe a coach 15, 20 years to kind of get a good formula for, they can get it in 4 to 8 years. And so I put the little master there at the top because true mastery, I believe, is for our clients that we work for, and our job is to really get them to not need us, right? If we do a good job of educating, that's really what coaching is. It is education. Then it's a more dynamic kind of sense of enlightenment, if you will, for them, where they realize they have a lot more control over their own process than they thought. For a long time coming up, I thought maybe this coach will help me develop, and I put so much stock into the coaches I was working with, and a lot of them meant well, but also were kind of blinded by their own egoic pursuits that they didn't really allow me to kind of have a little bit of say in it as well, and it actually kind of hampered me a little bit towards the end of my career. And that's one of the things I try to help athletes avoid, which is kind of building them up with their own tools to kind of coach themselves a little bit. Now, that being said, I don't want them being argumentative or going off program all the time, but if they can give me a good reason why they did, or they can articulate maybe why something I had planned for them isn't the best idea for them, then I'm more than happy to adjust and accommodate for their schedule, because at the end of the day, I think everybody ends up knowing their body best and having intuition. So if they're armed with principles that we know as sports performance coaches, they're going to be much more prepared to peak for whatever their event is or whatever their end destination is as a college or professional athlete. If we give them basically mastery over the weight room, without that being the obsessive part, where there were plenty of baseball players, myself included was one of them, who were a master of the weight room but weren't able to pair it with the skill portion of the sport, which is why my career ended after college, right? And so that's a big portion of that as performance coaches, is getting the balance for those kids between skill acquisition and performance pursuits. And so that's kind of the picture I wanted to paint with this analogy here, is that as a sports performance coach, this is a continuing cycle, and it doesn't just happen once. It can happen, that process from becoming a middle schooler to a high schooler, becoming a younger high schooler to a more senior high schooler where you're getting ready to go off to college or maybe get drafted. And then as a college athlete, maybe trying to climb the ranks from a smaller school to a bigger school, or a bigger school but you're not playing at, to another school where you play at and perform and have a chance to play pro. And honestly, too, getting these kids set up for life after sports, because it's at the end of the day, sports are not everything. They are a great tool and education for life, because you learn how to persevere through adversity and have discipline and all of these things. But at the end of the day, it is just a sport. Though there are more stakes on the line for some of these pro guys with millions of dollars on the line. But the quote I'll kind of wrap all of that story up with is, "It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken adults." And that's kind of what I was alluding to with, it's bigger than just sports, right? So from 8 and under, there's a totally different approach to the athletic development process than there is for that 8 to 12 gap, than there is from 13 to 15, than there is from 15 to 18, and then obviously adulthood. So I kind of chunk it up into seasons of life, and I try to have kids training match those different maturation periods, and we'll get a little bit more into that with some science here later in the presentation. And so the why I do this, why I'm giving this presentation, hopefully why some of you guys are doing this as well, is wellness overall, right? As great as it is to maybe coach a kid and get them to go to a Power 5 Division I school, or get them drafted, and watch them succeed and make $1 million playing pro. That stuff comes to an end one day too. Want to hopefully leave society better than we found it with all the people that we work with. And coaching really does have a big role on their mental, social, and emotional well-being as well. So we'll kind of get into that a little bit more with Maslow's hierarchy. And I think, the biggest thing that we hit on as coaches are obviously in this kind of physiological need area. We're always preaching and coaching, nutrition, sleep, obviously putting out hard work and being a go-getter when it comes to the physical pursuits. But obviously not every kid has the same access. A kid who is a country club kid versus a kid who's in a urban, single parent household are going to have two totally different, basically, kind of, upbringings that are in this physiological needs that are going to drive their pursuits one way or the other. Not saying, all kids coming from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are more hungry than kids with a higher socioeconomic up background motivation, but it definitely plays a factor. But at the end of the day, the kind of the point I'm making is, the more we can widen out that pyramid on the physical side and give these kids real tool sets and invest in them, obviously the better things go up that food pyramid that we see here with Maslow's hierarchy as far as security and kind of social esteem and actualizing whatever their goals are. And that's kind of what we're here to facilitate as coaches, though it may just seem like X's and O's of moving more weight, jumping higher, running faster, throwing harder, all that stuff. And so, again, I said I started my business, the Athletes Online Strength and Conditioning. If I had to kind of sum up the ethos of my business, is to just have a higher sum of positive habits than the sum of negative habits, because it's very easy, especially in this online world that a lot of these kids have to navigate, that a lot of us coaches maybe didn't have to navigate with social media and the pressures of all that. It's just helping them understand how to build a growth mindset and not fall into a victim mindset, and preaching kind of, how to get access to natural foods, how to cook it, how to learn to live that lifestyle. I'm not saying they can't have some processed foods and Chick-fil-A and things like that every now and again. It's not necessarily a bad thing in small quantities, but just, again, getting them to understand the sum of their habits. Again, just the movement versus sedentary lifestyle with the increase in screen time and, the outdoor time kind of doesn't go away when they're just kids into adulthood. It's something we want to kind of keep that playful spirit alive from when they're little kids all the way into hopefully maybe a pro career. And that's something that is instilled from, the adults around them, hopefully, or sometimes negated depending on, we've seen that before with the overbearing parent or the drill sergeant coach that kind of makes the sport not fun. So obviously there's a time and a place for that stuff, but I like to think because we are not directly in charge of their playing time as performance coaches, we can help tip the scale more towards that some positive habits to hopefully outweigh maybe some of the negative experiences they're experiencing on whatever team or whatever part of their sport skill journey they're on. The other thing that I try to hammer home with kids is they have these aspirations of playing in the college and professional level, but it is a funnel and it gets narrower and narrower the higher you climb. And then the kind of not so pleasant side that people don't necessarily want to talk about because they have to make money and sell things to kids is there is an increased amount of time and sacrifice that goes in to attaining these goals. And so it's not very sexy a lot of the times, to kind of really let these kids know, like, no, this is what it takes, especially if you're not the most genetically blessed, to reach the goals you say you want to reach, and letting them know that these pro guys, they get paid, yes, an absurd amount of money, but they also put in an absurd amount of sacrifice. They're on the road 200-300 days a year if they're a baseball player, 100-200 days a year if they're a football, basketball player. That's just in their season, let alone the prep time it takes to get ready for something like that. There's a ton of sacrifice that goes along with that lifestyle that you kind of have to be making sure that your kids are aware of, and kind of really teach them to learn to love the process. So that way it's a little less of a sacrifice and it's a little more of an investment type strategy is how I like to put it with my guys. So how do we approach that long-term athletic development model? Well, the one paper that I always come back to, I've read a lot of peer-reviewed journals in my time as a strength and conditioning coach, trying to further my education and understanding of things. But this one always sticks home, and it kind of really solidifies to me, the art of coaching versus these technical models that a lot of us sometimes get married to. And that's pretty simple as the optimal theory of motor learning. So if we put it very simply, it's vicious versus virtuous cycles. It's very easy to overcoach and make it seem like someone's doing more than they are, especially from a private sector understanding, where these parents come in and they see all this flashy stuff, but is it really moving the needle? There's a ton of you know hard-nosed kids out there with less access to high quality training and equipment that just have way more intent than same kids, same age, same sport. And the fact of the matter is they're in a virtuous cycle because they're not focusing on this kind of artificial task. And so this is the long of the short, is that it's less about what we do and it's more about what we create for our athletes in terms of an environment, right? So this whole paper goes into the fact that the environmental stimuli is going to produce more motor learning than any cue, any barbell exercise that we are going to put an athlete through, because it really does boil down to data set points. And so you need more information, more variety, more chaos, basically. And so that way, the basically human anatomy as a bioorganism, almost like a biological computer, can retain this information and have a database to now make adjustments and learn, right? No different than the stuff you're seeing in artificial intelligence with machine learning. Our body's been doing that for thousands of years, from hunter-gatherers all the way up into the NFL, MLB, and NBA. And so why do I kind of get into this soapbox about creating the environment? Well, I'll give a little story about myself in college. I was struggling with the yips. For those of you that don't know what that is, it is a kind of neurological, also, but a psychosomatic issue that a lot of baseball and sometimes football and golfers will get, where they basically kind of forget how to throw or lose the ability to throw. It's still not super widely understood. For me, it had a lot to do with having an injury, but also some other psychosomatic things that went on with just adjusting to college lifestyle. And I did transfer schools as well. And in the process of coming back from the yips, I talked to this one doctor named Dr. Richard Crowley. He worked with Tiger Woods when he had the yips. And, he had a video on the internet that I saw and I found, and I took a picture of his video with this clip here. And if you look on the right side, the creative side of the brain, that arts or motor skill is where most of that information is processed. So I find it funny that in the performance field, we all practice this art of motor skill, of movement and learning, something that is so intuitive and creative. And then we have a lot of left brain type people who have put a ton of time and research into the sports science, which is actually very beneficial because you're maximizing both sides of it. But at the end of the day, we have to remember our kids are not sports performance coaches, and we need to kind of have some creative thinking and some plain language that can help them access this portion of their brain when it comes to building motor skill. And so that was definitely something I struggled with early on as a coach, because I was an athlete and I kind of was like had feel in this right brain approach as an athlete, and then I got into the strength and conditioning stuff and started kind of learning all this left brain science and analytical type thinking, trying to improve all of my points of performance. And I tried to implement that on the coaching side, and it wasn't working too well. And I kind of thought back about how my meetings with the yips doctor, Dr. Crowley, went, and I realized that my language wasn't getting into the right side of their brain. So you'll hear me talk about, and I'll do a presentation on my kind of animal daily undulating periodization philosophy, and why I use those terms with kids, and how that's also influenced my coaching as far as the language I use. I don't try to use the names of muscles a ton or any of that type of stuff. It's really getting kids to use analogies with animals or experiences that are important, prevalent to them, something they maybe experienced in another sport, or maybe even another discipline, if they're a musician or into theater, or whatever it may be, something that kind of really hits this right side of the brain. I've seen it in person work much better for movement correction and getting the most out of a drill or an exercise by kind of understanding this right brain thinking philosophy. Because at the end of the day, we have to remember, uh, this is what's inside of there is a flying spaghetti monster, and those roots are very, very deep in a lot of people, right? The quote that comes to mind is, "The mightiest oak does not necessarily sprout first," right? So that if you create a really good environment for someone to grow their roots deep, right? So they have good access to quality strength training. They have a safe space where they can explore different movement options, whether that's gymnastics or just general mobility stuff. Um, there's a lot of different options out there that can help you as a coach start to really understand this kind of vicious versus virtuous cycle, right? And we always used to call these big kind of green oak players what we call uniform guys. And there's plenty of guys that kind of look the part, but there's so much more going under the hood as far as the nervous system is concerned that makes an athlete. It's obviously a little bit more prevalent in baseball, where you can see a guy with maybe not the best beach body being one of the more athletic or skilled people on the field. But it's the same for any sport. I mean, look at Jokic for the NBA, or even a Tom Brady or something like that for the NFL, right? You don't necessarily have to be the most freak of a genetic specimen to be the most skilled player. It takes a lot of time and reps and some creativity as well. Um, so the layman's anatomy that I always give the kids is, yeah, we're here to work on your musculoskeletal system, but there's all these other systems in play that are probably equally, if not more important, with the nervous system being the biggest one that we can influence as coaches. When I talk about us creating an environment, that's really what we're doing. Is we're nervous system manipulators, right? We understand these other factors as far as, probably especially in the strength and conditioning world, the musculoskeletal system and the circulatory and respiratory system as the biggest ones. And then we can kind of harp on some of the nutrition stuff for digestive, lymphatic, and endocrine systems. But at the end of the day, the one that we care the most about is the nervous system, right? And we kind of see this with kind of a cascading effect, but the types of exercises we choose affect things like rate coding, tendon adaptation. If we pick the right type of periodization and approach to weightlifting and weightlifting exercises, we can get increased myofibril density, increased number of type 2 fibers, which in turn can allow for more myelination or twitchiness, and also the important ones, which are Wolff's Law, bigger or more bone mineral density, and Davis's Law, which is better muscle fiber orientations. So we'll again use baseball as an example. That rotational aspect, being able to kinetically sequence, better than the next guy. Picking good exercises for that helps with all of these things, and some are more important for performance numbers, others are more important for technique and longevity. So, um, I try not to get too deep into some of the science stuff, just because you guys see that all the time from a lot of other people with a lot more research experience than myself. I like to look at it and read it, and I can talk about it, but I hope some of you out there can look at this as more of a practical presentation with some toolboxes that you can use on your next coaching adventure. So this is how I break my coaching down: is movement patterns, movement sequences, intensity, volume, and frequency. My environment is just a manipulation of these variables, no different than how when you watch a DJ or someone in the music studio mixing a record for someone, they push one knob and 4, 5, or 6 knobs change with that one master knob that they're changing, right? And so, movement patterns will kind of dictate that first. Movement sequences, both within the pattern that you're choosing for your main exercise, but then also the sequences of movements throughout the exercise regimen for the day. Obviously, the intensity, volume, and frequency, those are the things we're all manipulating as sports performance coaches to hit our adaptations for whatever period we're in within our coaching cycle with them. And so to get to that 8-year timeline a little bit, from 12U to 16U, and to use that same kind of allegory with the rolling hills into the more craggy mountains. When they're younger, we want more movement variability, lower resistance frequency because they don't have the hormonal profile to handle higher volume or higher intensity, higher loaded type exercises. We want them to have higher volume because we want them to experience that movement variability. We also want to build, kind of their nervous system up in terms of that variability, as well as the important ones like the respiratory and circulatory system. When they're younger, that's more important to build a bigger capacity. One of the things I always harp on parents is getting kids into swimming or martial arts or gymnastics because that's where a lot of the multi-sport talk comes from, is those types of sports hit a lot of these boxes on this side of the bell curve, which in turn, when someone picks a more specific skill sport like baseball or basketball, they tend to have higher success because they have a bigger base to pull from. The other thing to remember is they're kids, so less serious and more frequent training visits are going to instill a kind of love for training that may otherwise be taken with, starting with a more like Soviet or Chinese style, younger person's program where they're doing professional, dry, serious exercise regimens at a young age that require a ton of focus and discipline when they're just starting out in their training journey. On that other end, the closer a lot of my athletes get to that high-level college or pro realm, this is where you separate the wheat from the chaff, or the milk from the cream from the crop. And this is where you do need to get into more movement specificity. This is where you do need to get into a higher resistance training frequency because they have that small window from 15 to 25 of peak hormonal profiles and development. Lower volume because they are playing more at this age. Especially you look at sports like basketball. There's a ton of injuries, at that sport at that age because of the amount that these travel teams are playing these days. And also basketball players tend to be a little less performance minded. It's gotten way better over recent years, but just, you don't see those guys kind of meet heading out like some of the football and baseball players, which is not necessarily a bad thing, especially for their sport. But I'm digressing a little. Getting into advanced compound patterns and more serious or dedicated and disciplined training goes a long way. If you can get a 17 or 18-year-old, to the level of a college sophomore, both in strength and program understanding, they're going to be that much more of an asset to their team because A, they're going to be physically prepared when they show up on campus, and B, they're going to be less of a liability for the performance coach that I may be handing them off to. And so I always made it my job to make sure, the kids were ready for the ones that were older. And so, for the young kids, this is kind of what I call the ABCs of resistance training, right? So for a brief period of time, I worked at a youth performance kind of academy where they had soccer and football and basketball all around the grounds and leagues and different things like that. So I had a ton of athletes from that 8 to 14-year-old realm where they were just getting into weightlifting for the first time. And so I wanted to keep it very simple where they had A day that they could choose from, a B day they could choose from, and a C day they could choose from when it came for weightlifting time. I also would kind of basically have a group periodization as far as the movement variety and skills development because of the nature of these kids' ages. I wanted it to be fun. I wanted it to be variable and a little less serious, but we still hammered some of the same principles that you need to chase speed adaptations or agility adaptations as far as, the vectors that they're hitting and the amount of volume they're changing directions, all that stuff, right? But then when it came to the thing that arguably makes them a better athlete, I did not want to overcomplicate it for them or make it boring or unenjoyable. And it also is something, there was something beautiful about the freedom of choice that they had between an A day, a B day, or C day, because it really allowed them to learn that intuition of their body. A kid would come to me and be super sore from a game before, And maybe I have one kid that was, very intrinsically motivated, and he would have been like, I'm gonna hit the barbell split squat heavy lower body day. And I'm like, well, you just crushed like 2 games this weekend, and you're here on a Monday. Why don't we hit, your C day, right? And that way, you can kind of work some accessory muscles. It's not too heavy and too strenuous. And then you can come back tomorrow and we'll hit upper body, and then you'll be ready to crush a real lower body workout on Wednesday, right? And it's like my way of kind of coaching them through that intuitive process versus kind of slapping a cookie cutter template based off of, well, it's the beginning of the week, so you should do his hardest workout. And that's great in terms of generalizing programs, because usually, yes, people are fresher on Monday than they are, say, Friday, but it's not the case for every kid. And a lot of them really enjoyed that. At the same time, I also, with young kids, would have kids who like to slack off because they hadn't learned that kind of what you input is what you get in terms of output yet. And so maybe they didn't play over the weekend and they were just kind of tired, and they'd be like, coach, I'm gonna kind of do my C day. I don't really want to hit the weights. I just want to move my body. And I was never against that, but I always try to coach them, be like, you're not going to get any better unless you push yourself, right? And that's kind of where you can have that real kind of heart-to-heart moment with them. And sometimes it would work, and they would hit that heavier workout, and other times it wouldn't. But I just found a lot of positive results in the private sector with this kind of, I don't want to say illusion of choice, but this kind of simple yet variable approach to that kind of 8 to 16-year-old range, because it is modifiable for all levels with this particular approach. This is a small sample of that, obviously. And so the other thing that I kind of wanted to make a point with the 8-year timeline is some ratios. And so having a martial arts background, the belts made a lot of sense to me as far as obtaining a little bit of that mastery. These are by no means like hard guidelines, but it's something that I think is very obtainable for athletes should they choose to pursue mastery and discipline. And so, nothing crazy, but starting off with basically body weights, split squats or push-ups for being able to do one clean set of 20, building those kind of mitochondria and that aerobic system up, and just that general connective tissue. Obviously borrowing from Dr. Michael Yesis's work on the weightlifting side of things. Just being able to do that, I think, is a good marker of health for most kids. If they can do one set of 20 of 3, 4, 5 different exercises, that's a great place to start. Especially, I always start with the younger kids because I think they get a lot more from that body weight training than, because of a lot of different reasons, neurological, fascia, all these different properties and principles, than the barbell. Obviously, I'd still let them kind of progress from dumbbell or kettlebell to barbell training. But from there, some goals that we would hit before letting them move on to more traditional kind of, 3x5 type barbell starting strength training was quarter body weight times 20 and half body weight times 20. So whether that's I have a 100-pound kid doing a 50-pound goblet squat for 20, I think they get a lot more out of that than trying to make some 100-pound 10-year-old squat 200 pounds. They're not at the right time period to do that. And so it doesn't necessarily have to hit it in those year periods. I just made the year periods very long because we're stratifying for 8-year-olds. A lot of times this progression would speed up quite a bit within a 2 to 4 year window if we're talking about starting with a hormonally primed 14-year-old freshman. And with that being said, I do think most kids within 4 to 8 years of training can hit that 1.5 times body weight to even 2 times body weight, depending on the genetics and the lift itself. And that's a great place to start for improving the other metrics, which are power and speed. And so you kind of see my speed categories there is 2.2 seconds on a 10-yard dash, all the way down to a 1.55 seconds, kind of being a basic mastery. It's loosely, you don't necessarily have to hit those numbers to be a college or pro athlete, but it's a great range that I found stratified very well from kind of beginner to elite athletes. And so I would say that for the power numbers, I like to use height on the broad jump and kind of use that number right there. So I'm not going to bore you too much with that, right? 1.6 times 6 foot tall, but that's your elite athlete jumping 11 foot plus, right? And so I would kind of keep it simple in these power, speed, agility categories, and then obviously a kind of a strength category and a cardiovascular category to assess my athletes on. Within the power category, a vertical jump, a broad foot, a med ball throw, kind of get horizontal, vertical, and upper body power displacement. Speed category, a little bit of a reactive strength index on a depth drop. A 10-yard dash for that acceleration and more muscular dominant display of athleticism, and then the top speed one, which is a little bit more of an elastic and nervous system display of athleticism. So kind of good stratification there. And then agility category, your simple 5-10-5. See how well their braking force is without getting fancy with like Hawkins plates. And then infinity drills, which is something I think is often overlooked because there's the ocular component to it. For those of you that are familiar with Cal Dietz's goat drill, that's pretty much what I would assess them on with different patterns, which is the regular one, the hip flip, and the head flip. And then for the main lifts that we would hit on strength categories, a hex deadlift, a back squat, a split squat, a chin up with weight once they got to it, bench press, push press, and that's pretty much it. Those 6 were pretty easy numbers for a lot of athletes to kind of, get their starting strength from. And then in the cardio category, I really like the 10x10 test, which is pretty much Derek Hansen's 10-yard sprints, but just in the shortest time as possible. A 500-meter row is a great basic cardiovascular kind of power output test. And then one that's not so common is a seated exhale hold. If you've gotten into any kind of the buteyko breathing or hypercapnic training, it just gives you a little look into the kind of metabolic health of a kid without doing a full-on testing with some of the more appropriate scientific apparatuses. So to kind of put it all together, I would say it is easier to build strong children than to repair broken adults. That's always been my approach to it. When they're 8 and under, they need copious free-range play. That's why I put my daughter climbing our indoor jungle gym in our house. It's something that should be encouraged. Obviously not dangerous play, but a little bit of risk goes a long way in building their confidence and also improving their athleticism without actually training. And then from 8 to 12, a little more organized play, getting into some basic loading patterns if they express the desire to, or if you, mean well for your kid and kind of set a good example and they train with you, letting them start to do body weight exercises and some light dumbbell loading patterns. And then when it starts to really metaphorically and literally a rubber hit the road, 13 to 15, more competitive play. Think like race and chase drills in your performance center. Obviously, they're getting more competitive on their respective sports skills, and getting into intermediate loading patterns. So, some basic barbell training, maybe introducing Olympic lifting or landmine training. And from there, from 15 to 18, getting into that very specific competitive play and advanced loading patterns. And that's the full deal, right? All the stuff that you would see in the D1 weight room, that's what I tried to give my kids on a day-to-day basis, and getting into a lot of it without getting too scientific for them. As much as I enjoyed that portion of it, I found it is off-putting to a lot of kids. They want to go to an environment where, it's a little more cool or hip or just socially enjoyable to be around. And, they'll respect you for having a plan and some scientific understanding, and maybe occasionally you need to convince a kid of why you're doing something with that. But for the most part, it just needs to be very intense. And then obviously adulthood, if they do all of these things, they're going to have a larger reserves of metabolic efficiency and the life skills to, be the best they can be. And so the study that I kind of mirrored this talk off of is as follows, and that's pretty well known. I think at this point, if you guys have read any of the periodization journals that you can find on the internet, but I don't want to take credit for it because it's not my work. But if you want to get even more into the weeds of the percentages and the exercises for each multi-year plan within those kind of 2 to 4 year windows, I definitely recommend purchasing this journal because I have it and I've used it or borrowed from it over the years, and it works very, very well. The main thing I wanted to kind of hammer home with that time not being a renewable resource is for their age within that 8-year window, the number of sessions that it would take and what that compounds to. So if they're an off-season only trainer, like we talked about in the beginning with that myth, it's only 100 to 600 training sessions that they could acquire based off of their time input into it. And at the end of the day, both quality and quantity matter in the training game, and that 8-year window ticks by fast. If they're an in-season, year-round trainer, but they're a little more reserved in their approach, and they're a 1 to 2 times a week type of person, or maybe a 2 to 3 times a week type of person, which I think is the sweet spot for most athletes that are pursuing excellence. They're going to have anywhere from 300 to 1,100 training sessions in that 8-year window from 12 to 18, or 10 to 18. And then if they're super dedicated, and this is kind of the minimum or maximum I would recommend to them from at least an intense training standpoint with sprints, jumps, weights, all that stuff 3 to 4 times a week, then they're going to hit anywhere from 600 to 2,200 sessions in that time window. Not saying they can't train 5 or 6 times a week, but I think that's where you start to get into that obsessive pattern a little bit, and they would benefit more from the rewards of sleeping more, eating, resting, socializing, and not missing out on life, being a well-rounded human being like we talked about earlier. But that's usually always my sales pitch in the private sector is if you look and we're able to actually go back and get the data on all the top players, they're definitely closer to that 600 to 2,200 training sessions in the weight room, let alone even getting into the skill acquisition numbers versus a lot of the kids that mostly fall in the 100 to 600 category. So I'll leave it at that. The other thing that this is a little bit more anecdotal, so that's why you see the drawn lines. I don't have specific data for it, but I do like bar graphs, and I think it helps people understand kind of what maybe I've seen over the course of my years doing it as both an athlete and a coach. If you look at the blue line, which is the heavy compound movements, the adaptations, rewards versus your number of sessions over your career, there's a way more benefit in adopting compound movements early on. And then once you kind of max those out and hit that, relative strength, 1.5 to 2 times body weight number, the benefit of pounding those goes way down into that later stage of their, say 17, 18, oftentimes because of their training age is really going to be 23 and older. We're talking mostly for kids that are now playing college or just even enjoying the benefits of being an adult sports performance enthusiast. That sweet spot definitely drops on the compounds. Hypertrophy training is kind of the same deal. Is you want to kind of put that a little ahead of the compound training. They kind of go hand in hand, but at the same time, there's a sweet spot there where that kind of needs to be the priority when they're taking advantage of their metabolic hormonal window from 14 to 25 or whatever. And then as they start to age, chasing those doesn't necessarily improve their performance gains. And we're using that in a hypertrophy, like bodybuilding sense, right? So obviously having more muscle mass is going to be beneficial, but not at the sake of just having muscle mass, right? And I don't want to get too much into it here. I can do a separate video on it, but that, kind of myofibrillar versus sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Then speed work, less important doing diligent speed work when they're younger and just kind of making it more fun, games, intent driven. And then, that peaks at that same window when they're kind of hitting that sweet spot of 17 to 18 and 22 college range. And then I think that arguably is more important than the compounds and hypertrophy work as you age, because that is the first thing to go. And my time at Virginia High Performance was spent with a lot of special operations community members who were there for various injuries and were trying to either get back to duty or were just retired and dealing with the aftermath of a 20 plus year career in the tactical field. And that's the thing people tolerate least as far as tendons, joints, nervous system is speed work. So if you can keep that going, the more sessions you do over your lifetime, I think the better off you're going to be. And then same thing for accessory exercises. So less important when they're younger, because you want to hammer the meat and potatoes. And I don't mean movement variety. I just mean, let's say a lateral lunge versus a front squat. They're going to get more out of front squatting more each week than, progressing their lateral lunge by, 2 or 3 pounds, 5 pounds, whatever it is. It'll come much slower at that point too. So it's just ineffective. But as you get older, that movement variability definitely comes into play when you look into the different fascial mechanics, and also just managing, kind of one's workload. So you kind of trade off some of those compound movements for more intelligent accessory exercises, which we're seeing tons of great things with landmines, bands, Kaisers, all the excellent workout equipment that we're seeing in the modern sports performance landscape that can help you maintain, an elite level of athleticism and take a little bit of load off of the nervous system and allow you more time and energy to put that towards, if you're playing professionally, or just your life if you're not fortunate to play professionally and you're just pursuing adult performance at this point. And so that's kind of my spiel on where to put the 4 main types of training that we manage as a performance coach over the course of number of training sessions. And that's basically your training age, right? So from the time you start training, especially if we're looking at it through the lens of starting at somewhat of a young age, somewhere in the 8 to 14-year-old range, all the way through till you leave this earth, right? So another way to look at it is kind of that point of maximum yield, right? So you add, you want to stay in the sweet spot, and then you want to stay away from the negative returns, kind of getting into that person that's the obsessor, and overreaching may have a little bit of benefit, but unless you're an Olympic athlete, you might as well just kind of teeter in between the increasing returns and point of maximum yield and try to keep chasing that. And I also like this graph. I wanted to add it as far as importance and periodization. Nothing beats you can have the best program in the world, but if you don't adhere to it, then it's the worst program in the world. So I'd rather take a maybe even somewhat crappy program and the max amount of adherence than the best program in the world with very little or infrequent adherence. The next biggest variable: volume, intensity, and frequency. Again, we all know we're monitoring that, and so the better you can teach an athlete at a younger age to manipulate those variables for where they're at in their sports cycle and where they're at with their emotional stress and all of these things, the better adaptations you're going to get, because we want to do the most amount possible, but also the least amount possible to basically work smarter and not get harder. Right? And the rest kind of go without saying. I'm not going to go too deep into those, but that's my main point with all of that. And so kind of a hands-on framework to talk it through is, there's nothing wrong with a good dynamic warm-up. On days where they're low energy, turning it into more games, play is a great way. If you see people on the internet warming up with spike ball, or maybe a capture the flag, or speed ball, whatever it is. I even we used to play this game when I was a kid, Ninja, where you stand in a circle and you try to slap the person. It's basically like hot hands, hot feet. There's all kinds of ways to get creative on your warm-up to get people enticed into the workout for the day. The next one would be movement literacy, and so that's where you're following kind of that. At least in the private sector, we do group, weekly undulating periodization, where Mondays or maybe it'd be more acceleration. Wednesdays are a little more top speed. Fridays are a little more conditioning. Whereas when they're in season, we might kind of nix the conditioning portion and we flip flop it, and we kind of hit a movement variety and kind of a re-education day on Monday, and then they hit the top speed on Wednesday, but very low volume, and then a little acceleration work on Friday is almost like a primer stimulus for their weekend tournaments and things like that. But from there, that speed and power stimulus. So that's, again, maybe it's sprints, maybe it's jumps, maybe it's some Olympic lifting derivatives, landmine derivatives, um, and then kind of getting into agility and bioenergetic adaptations. I really, people like to hate on agility drills. I'm not a big ladder guy as far as that improving agility. That's more of a warm-up modality or a conditioning tool. But different agility circuits that you could set up are a great way to get some specific energetic adaptations in. So like if you use Cal Dietz's like AFSM method, you can maybe have 3 or 4 different small-sided games, or kind of just like chase the mirror drill type of thing, when maybe they're all 10 seconds long and they have to walk to the next station. It's a great way to do team training, because they're getting a little bit of in-season conditioning, but really it's high rate of force development, great movement vector profile, and you're keeping that bioenergetic time cap on whatever their sport is. If it is a more oxidative sport, I still like to stick to the shorter periods one, so that way the quality is higher, and even the kind of best cross country runner is going to benefit from having better anaerobic work capacity, even though their sport's mostly aerobic. And then obviously the big one, resistance training, nervous system modification. That's the meat and potatoes of programming, which I will kind of get into a different presentation. And then a cool down and integration. And so this last one is where I really like to hammer home with kids, especially, and private sector facilities or one-on-one coaches, or even college coaches for that matter, really teaching them to downregulate. And so, not saying you have to go and do like yoga with them, but even just laying down, turning off the lights, and teaching them that it is a skill to calm down and use breath work, right? So nose breathing, longer exhales and inhales, stimulating parasympathetic vagal tone. Especially with young kids, they love it. I just used to call it nap time, and make them earn their nap time was always the joke that we would talk about. But it helps them integrate all the stuff they learn, versus if they just scream off in this still maybe slightly sympathetic state from sprinting, jumping, competing, heavy lifting, fast lifting. I think there's a lot to be said about giving them an emotional regulation tool that can be applied in the middle of a game. And I would always have them use some visualization drills during this too, with take a play that you maybe messed up on, and then when they're inhaling, they'll think about that play, and then they would exhale and rewrite or visualize that play in a different light, and how it would feel in their body, how they would execute it, and basically kind of, again, going back to that virtuous versus vicious cycle, right? That's the perfect way to kind of take the literal environment personification of vicious versus virtuous cycle that we created in the weight room and performance facility, and then now bring it internally to the nervous system, which we talked about as the most important thing, and kind of wrap it all up together, so that way we're having a positive impact on these kids. And so I'll kind of leave you with this, running with my daughter and having fun. She doesn't know we're training yet, even though we're just having fun, is if we do not create and control our environment creates and controls us. So that is what I would say is, long-term athletic development strategy, is understanding the environmental landscape. If you're a parent watching this, or you're a sports performance coach watching this, being able to see where they're at on that journey we talked about in the beginning, and being able to kind of pull the levers to curate your environment so it's in line with whatever it is that you're chasing as an athlete or as a coach. And so with that, I said thank you, and this is where you guys can reach me. All right.